Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 650. Good grief, 650 for the 28th of March 2021. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia, which is, like most of New South Wales and parts of Queensland, drying out from the flood emergency disaster that was last week. Although, of course, not completely over, many areas are still affected by the floods, which were described at various times as once in 50 years, once in 100 years, once in a generation. They were quite big floods. Coming up on today's show, the 650th time the Skeptic Zone has been produced, or more or less, because I did a few sort of funny specials early on with videos and whatever, but let's call it 650. I speak to an old friend of mine, Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, who has a very important message and story to tell about her plight with ovarian cancer. Now, Siobhan's attitude is remarkable, admirable. She is such a sunny person, sunny disposition, happy person, positive person. But her situation is, of course, serious. I think you will find this interview with Siobhan very interesting and moving, and more important, she has some very good information to tell you all. And at the end of the show, I will give a few more thoughts about my interview with Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. Coming up after that, it's the last part of our three-part interview with Dr. Brad McKay. Maynard talks to Brad about biochargers, solariums, and the importance of getting a second opinion. And to round off the show, we dive once more into Trove to look for references to the great Harry Houdini, especially his exploits, his adventures here in Australia, where he is in some quarters credited as the first man to fly an aircraft in Australia. That is disputed. It seems likely he was amongst the first men to fly an aircraft here in Australia, but nevertheless, some interesting reports from around 1910. So no matter what you're doing, if you're driving along listening to the show, if you're out jogging or walking, like I like to do, long walks, listening to various podcasts, if you're doing chores around the house, oh yes, the dreaded vacuuming, cleaning up the kitchen, ironing, that sort of thing. I hope you enjoy this week's episode of the show, but now it's time for me to run downstairs. No waffles, but I will have a pancake or three and some maple syrup. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Hello.
Oh, he's already out.
I'm here with Siobhan O'Sullivan, Dr. Siobhan, and friend.
Mr. Tom-Toms.
Mr. Tom-Toms.
Oh, just Tom-Toms. Tom-Toms to his friends, Mr. when he's being a bit more formal. But he is in his tuxedo, so he's always ready for a formal event.
Hello. You're a friendly little fella. He's coming to investigate all the setup here.
He should just have a sniff and not be of any problem. Should.
Well, I'm here with Dr. Siobhan. Siobhan, now we haven't seen each other for a while. We caught up last week, and Skeptic Zone listeners might be interested to know that I interviewed you 6 years ago.
Doesn't time fly
about your podcast, Knowing Animals. And we met not long before that at a podcast meetup group here in Sydney. Now, I've come over to have a chat with you today because since those days, your life, especially in the last 6-7 months, has completely and utterly changed. So, in your own words.
Yeah, so it was during the pandemic, so it was 2020, and around the middle of the year, kind of mid-July, I started to feel a little bit not so good. So I had a period of about 2 weeks where I was going around saying to people, I don't feel quite right. I don't know what's wrong. I think I'm just stressed. And my father was very ill at the time, and he would die actually very soon after this. Oh. And so I just put it down to circumstance. I was feeling a little bit bloated in my midsection, a little bit denser than normal, but it was COVID and I wasn't getting dressed in my normal work clothes. I was in more inactive wear, and I just thought, I've put on a little bit of weight and I'm feeling a bit stressed because my father's so sick. And then after about 2 weeks of that, I really felt terrible. I did go to my GP, and the first thing the GP said to me was that it's probably constipation and I should go away and take a whole lot of laxatives, etc. So I actually did do that for 3 days, just felt worse and worse every day. So then I went back to the GP and I said, look, it's clearly not constipation. And the GP said, look, it could be a whole range of different things. We're going to start off assuming the worst and test for the worst. And then hopefully we just land at being something simple or relatively simple, such as irritable bowel, etc. So they took my bloods. I came back home actually to where we are right now. And then after a couple of hours, my GP rang me and said a particular marker in the blood that is an indication of cancer, in my case, was extremely elevated, and that I should go to RPA, which is the local hospital, public hospital here in Sydney's Inner West. I should go to RPA, Royal Prince Alfred, right away. And he also said, what's wrong with you is something very serious. I don't know what it is, but it's something very serious. So pack a bag, because they're not going to let you go until they work out what the problem is.
Wow.
So I went there to RPA. For people who know it, it is a very, very old hospital.
Yeah.
In my view, it's a hospital that's in need of a lot of investment. So its emergency room is not a pleasant place to be, particularly during COVID, where everyone was in masks and you could only have certain people in the room, etc., etc. When I got there, I did tell them about this marker in my blood being very elevated, and I think that they were doubtful about how elevated it was, because this particular indicator is meant to sit kind of around 15. And when I went to RPA, it was about 280.
Wow. And
it got up to 490. And so the first thing they said is that it may well be appendicitis. And then they did a CAT scan, CT scan, and once they did, they could see that in actual fact it was ovarian cancer. So I was diagnosed then, and that evening I was moved over to Chris O'Brien Lifehouse, which is a fantastic cancer hospital here in Sydney. And that was probably one of the best things that's happened to me since this all started, is discovering that this world-class cancer hospital is right on my doorstep. So my heart really goes out to all the people living in rural and regional Australia who, don't have access to places like Chris O'Brien Lifehouse. So I went there, and then I just, from that point in time, started to really learn, what was happening to me. I knew precious little about ovarian cancer. I'd never really thought about it. I didn't realise how serious it is. But of course, I quickly became educated at that time.
Yeah, and what month was that? When?
That was in August. That was the very beginning of August 2020.
Not long ago.
Not long ago. One of the amazing things for me, and I think of my friends and family, is that even though it was, 6-7 months ago that I was diagnosed, the cancer has become absolutely overwhelming. It's kind of the most important narrative.
Here we are having this incredibly serious conversation, and the cat has jumped up right between us, is checking everything out.
One of my cats, Tom, he is a very naughty boy, but so far he's just sniffing. He's not actually taking anything apart, so we can be grateful for small mercies.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but the cat just leapt up right up here. So the Life House, it's called.
It's called the Chris O'Brien Life House. It's a specialist cancer hospital. It's world class, and just I've not had a huge amount of luck with this whole cancer thing, including actually contracting it, because it is a very rare cancer, and I got it extremely young.
Yeah.
But in the midst of a great deal of bad luck, one good thing that has happened to me is that I happen to live very close to this world-class cancer hospital.
Now, you in our conversation before, he's going for the microphone. Look at that.
He's just having a little sniff so far. I'm watching you, Tom-Toms.
Oh, dear, he's completely destroying the atmosphere of the interview, but that's sort of okay. So, yes, now, when we met last week for a coffee and you were explaining the situation a little bit more fully to me, you were saying how important it is for you now to really help educate other women as to this cancer.
Yeah, it is. It is a priority for me to speak out and to raise awareness. When I think about the moment I was diagnosed, I just knew nothing. And part of the reason I knew nothing was because I'd never known anyone who had ovarian cancer. But also there just isn't the community education and awareness that I think we have developed in relation to things such as breast cancer and skin cancer and prostate cancer and things like that. People just simply do not know. And my friends and family have all been shocked by everything that's happened. Many people I know have been off to have themselves tested because it just makes you realise, goodness, what's going on in my body. So there is a real absence of understanding about ovarian cancer, and at this point in time, the primary tool we have to deal with cancer is to get onto it early.
Early detection.
Early detection, early treatment. As soon as you start trying to address it, the greater your chances of success, and that is why ovarian cancer is so insidious, because when people are diagnosed, or women are diagnosed, they're typically either stage 3 or stage 4. And that's very late to be diagnosed.
So you can, and it was the case with you, it was in you, you had it, but you had no idea.
I had absolutely no idea whatsoever. When I was diagnosed, I was stage 3, which is a blessing. Stage 4 means that the cancer has spread from the primary location to another part of the body. So in my case, the cancer was still contained within my abdomen. So I was very fortunate in that regard. One of the things about ovarian cancer, however, that is just so disappointing and frustrating is that it is this creeping silent cancer, but also it does develop very quickly. So there's no way of really knowing for sure when I would have first had that cancer, but I did ask my surgeon about it, and she said it's feasible that I wouldn't have had the cancer at all at the start of 2020.
Wow.
And she said she's seen people who within 6 months have gone from having completely clear scans to being in the situation I was in, which is what they call very diseased.
That's not a very nice.
It's a wonderful expression. So yeah, this is one of the worries. It goes very, very quickly. It's a real monster.
Yeah. Wow. Very, very diseased.
Yeah, very diseased.
Who thought up that term? Now, one of the things too that we might touch on, because obviously this is the Skeptic Zone podcast, and we do look at these issues, is that, and I know it happens to other people, is when you're diagnosed with something like cancer, you get a wide range of people, and to be fair as possible, probably well-meaning, giving you all sorts of advice.
Yes,
you
absolutely.
Must have had that, yeah.
So I have experienced that, and it has been one of the really interesting phenomena that I've observed since I've been sick. I have, in a sense, been on the front foot. So the way I've decided to deal with this is to be open, upfront, transparent with people, to communicate widely to people what's happening, because I think it's easier than perhaps, allowing people to talk among themselves. I think it is better to be transparent and communicate what's going on.
Yeah.
So everyone kind of knew very quickly what was happening. But then what I observed was that people were coming to me with suggestions of cures or treatments or ways of managing ovarian cancer. The people that were doing this were people who were not medically trained in any way, shape or form. So not medical doctors, not nurses, not anyone working in allied, kind of certified allied professions. These were people who were completely removed from that world, but wanted to convey to me that they knew how to help heal me.
Wow.
Now, in some cases, the proposed treatments were rather, I guess, bizarre, but not really kind of invasive. Like, there are things that I could imagine you might do. I couldn't really imagine that there's any evidence that they're effective. But they were things like eating certain types of vegetables or fruits or some other strange thing in whatever combination. I also had one person approach me saying that they were able to heal me, but it would require me to divulge a considerable amount of personal information about myself. That conversation didn't get any further than that. My intuition is that the information was perhaps going to be of a sexual nature. I wasn't sure. But what I have been saying to all the people who are approaching me with non-scientifically confirmed treatments is I've decided to go with traditional medicine.
Yeah.
My view is that at Lifehouse, for example, they are open-minded in terms of facilitating complementary medicines to some extent. So, for example, they have dietitians on staff. They even have, for example, reflexologists.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they have acupuncturists, reflexologists, and exercise physiologists. So they do offer some degree of complementary medicine at Lifehouse, but it is supervised by someone who is a medical professional, and it is never, for example, intended to replace or undermine or overrule the medical.
Is this? Do you think that they're offering these sort of things to help women who are there who would get a? I think placebo is a too harsh a term in this situation. A soothing, something to make them feel better. Not get better, just feel better, feel more relaxed in that situation.
So the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse treats all kinds of cancers. So it's not just women, it's men, it's older people, it's small people, etc., young kids, the rest of it. So they do all kinds of cancer there, or treat all kinds of cancer there. I actually think it's perhaps a little bit more than that, to tell you the truth, Richard. So, for example, I've become quite friendly with the woman who does the reflexology, only because it turns out that we've got a mutual friend, and also because we're just chatty women who get along. She has told me that they are aiming to do a peer-reviewed study into whether reflexology does bring any benefit. So they are actually trying to study these things in ways that are use the scientific model. And to me, that is wonderful. I mean, I am not somebody who I suspect that reflexology does very little to treat cancer in any way, but perhaps it can alleviate nausea, for example. Perhaps it might be good in terms of sleeping and things like that. So I'm quite happy for them to do it and for them to also study it. I was offered each of the complementary medicines myself once to kind of try for free. And in my case, I've got an additional condition, which is a hypernausea condition. So I've been unbelievably nauseous basically since diagnosis. But it is now much more under control. I've had all the cancer cut out, so I'm only getting a little bit nauseous. And so when they did the complementary medicines for me, it was not because they thought it was going to cure the cancer or help with the cancer. They were trying to find a way to help with the nausea. So they thought that perhaps acupuncture could relieve some of the nausea, perhaps reflexology could relieve some of the nausea. So that, I think, is how they think about what they're doing. It's whether it can be somewhat helpful in managing.
No, but it doesn't impinge on the real medicine going on.
It certainly, no one at Lifehouse in any way, shape or form has suggested that I wouldn't have all the chemo and the surgery and all the rest of it. Indeed, I think they are very evidence-based and driven. One of the really, I've had not a huge amount of luck since this whole thing kicked off, but one of the strokes of luck I had was that in about the last 18 months, there's been a sizable change in how the chemo and surgery intersect in the case of ovarian cancer. And it used to be that the surgeon would remove the cancer in the uterus and the ovaries and all the rest of it, and then you would have your 6 rounds of chemo, which is the treatment for ovarian cancer. And now what they do is they give you 4 rounds of chemo, then they perform the surgery, and then they give you 2 more rounds of chemo. And so the aim is to shrink the cancer, remove the organs, and then use the last couple of rounds to clean up any cells that remain. And that's the procedure that I underwent. And I'm so grateful that I did, because if I had have had that, if I had have been treated, even 18 months ago, I think it's very clear that I, in all likelihood, would have ended up with a stoma, with a colostomy bag, because they wouldn't have been able to remove the cancer from the bowel. But because they were, because it was sufficiently shrunk as a result of the 4 rounds of chemo, the surgery was much better for me in my case. So I think they are very evidence-driven. They really want to do the right thing, and they, they take evidence and scientific process very seriously.
Right. Now, just quickly, one of the stories you were relating to me, again last week over a coffee, getting back to possibly well-meaning people, somebody was telling you that you had to think the right thoughts to get better or something like that?
Yes, that was actually a very strange one. That was something that happened to me actually very recently. And one of the things about this whole phenomenon of people feeling they can contribute to my healing without any without any apparent training or certification or qualification, is that I find I'm very uneasy about all these brilliant young people who do very well at school, get themselves into medical school, study so hard for years and years and years, and it's a grueling degree, the medical degree, and then they do their time in the hospitals and see all the different types of, practices and all the rest of it. And meanwhile, parallel, people are, waking up on a Tuesday and deciding that they can heal cancer with their, whatever's going on. So I ran into a woman who doesn't have cancer, but she was in the company of a number of people who did, and apparently, according to her, cancer is a result of any thoughts that you've had up until the age of 12, And in order to deal with your cancer, you need to go back and identify the thought pattern that was responsible. And I found this particular interpretation very hard to take. And a big part of the reason why I found it a very off-putting way of, I guess, communicating about cancer, or just not an appealing perspective, was that I thought about all the people, all the young children who have cancer, who might get the feeling that they're responsible for this in some way. You know, it's an awful feeling.
It's almost like victim blaming, isn't it?
It is almost like victim blaming. So it's a really awful.
Ultimately, it's your fault for something that happened way back in decades ago.
Yes, and not just, all the things that we know you shouldn't do, lying in the sun, smoking cigarettes, not being careful when working with chemicals, all those kinds of things that we know about. But this is the wrong thought. You're having a thought that gives you cancer. Yeah. It certainly gives you a lot of power, but I didn't give myself ovarian cancer. It's just not true, and it's not helpful. And I think I'm in a position to be able to see that kind of contribution for what it is. But I do worry about people who are perhaps going to be influenced or give some credence to this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very common, unfortunately. As I said, with people in your situation and other diseases, lots of well-meaning people. I know it works because it worked for me, or I saw this on the internet, or this guy told me, or... Yes. It goes on, and we've certainly dealt with that in the Skeptics. So, Siobhan, from your experience and your point of view, what's maybe the best advice you have to offer for our listeners?
So, what I encourage women to do is to be mindful about any changes in their body. The best indicator that we have at the moment that ovarian cancer might be at play is this bloating that I was talking about. But I really, really encourage anyone who's concerned about changes in their body to go to the doctors, but be persistent and insistent. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that happened to me that I noticed was that the doctors didn't necessarily take it seriously and didn't necessarily know what to look for. So as I said, my first diagnosis was constipation, and I wasn't tested for the more difficult, the more insidious things. And I think I probably should have been. So I would really encourage people to take a strong stand, to say to the doctor, have you considered ovarian cancer? Because I think we also need to remember that because it is a rare cancer, many, many GPs will perhaps never even come across it during their practice. So I think it is for women to be assertive and to ask to be tested. The thought that there are women who don't know they have ovarian cancer until they're stage 4, that's terrible. That means that they have endured some level of discomfort and bloating and whatever else to get to stage 4. So I think be proactive, be assertive, and also remind your GP about these rarer cancers.
And maybe, listeners, you might know somebody whose first choice or first port of call might just be to see a naturopath or a natural healer or something like that. But I guess a strong message would be, okay, if it's their free choice if they want to do that, but for heaven's sake, also see a GP and even get a second opinion.
Absolutely. I really think that dealing with ovarian cancer successfully really has to involve a medical professional, a doctor. The cancer will spread, and it will spread quickly, and it will kill you if you don't try traditional, if you don't fall back on, or if you don't utilise most fully the kind of the Western medical model. Yeah,
in the end, with something as serious as that, it's homeopathy is really not going to help much at all. It's really the scientifically based
Not
medicine.
at all.
Yeah.
And I do also think if you are determined or you have a strong desire to use homeopathy, then it really needs to be the thing that is complementary to the other medical treatments that you're getting. Lifehouse, with their very progressive attitude to complementary medicines, don't offer homeopathy.
That's good to hear. Well, Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, thank you very much. It's been great to see you once again.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a while
Richard.
since we've really caught up.
It's been a while,
Yeah.
and I really think it's wonderful, all the work you're doing to educate people and to engage them in these really important conversations. So thank you so much for everything you do for the world of evidence.
Thank you very much. And we're just saying before, here I am sitting on the floor, you're up there on the couch, and we've got our microphone set up, and this is almost exactly where we were 6 years ago when I was interviewing you about animal welfare.
Yes. So it's
And
wonderful to be back.
And your podcast you started is still going, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've got a podcast called Knowing Animals. We talk about animal issues, usually we talk about basically a published piece of work where animals are at the centre of the discussion. At the moment, I'm not hosting it because of my illness, but a wonderful colleague of mine has taken it over, and it is still, in my view, a very interesting and informative podcast.
Folks, I will link to that podcast in this week's show notes. If you're interested in animal welfare, which we all should be, that's the podcast for you. Well, again, Siobhan, wonderful to see you again, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Hi, my name's Jo Thornley, and I'd like you to join I'd like you to listen to my podcast about cults called Zealot. It's available pretty much anywhere you find podcasts, with further reading on the Zealot Facebook page. Each episode, a guest joins me to talk about a specific cult, where we answer the big questions like, is there yoga in it?
Is there yoga in it?
And does anyone think they're Jesus?
Does anyone think that Jesus?
Pop over to my compound and have a listen. I've just mixed up a fresh batch of Kool-Aid.
Oh, Zealot.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
And we're back with Dr Brad McKay talking about his book, Fake Medicine, and it's even got its own tinfoil hat on the front cover.
Yeah, so I've got a special tinfoil cover to go over the book just for you, Maynard.
And what about the actual products that are being sold that you mentioned in the Fake Medicine book? What is your favourite? Oh, come on.
Oh, where do I start? I think my favourite is still the biocharger from Pete Evans. I think if you're selling a fluorescent light for more than 25,000 Australian dollars, so 15,000 US dollars, and telling people that it's going to be protecting you from the Wuhan coronavirus, or else that it could cure your rheumatoid arthritis or autoimmune diseases, just the imagery of people like families sitting around a giant lamp that looks like it's from Back to the Future.
No, best to sit around the light with a player piano, where you're with the piano rolling and having a bit of a sing-along.
I'm sure that would affect the resonance that's coming out of the lamp.
Sorry.
Yes.
Right. Now, isn't there something medical that actually does do that on a small scale?
Well, we do use a narrowband ultraviolet light to help people with psoriasis or skin conditions. So we use that all the time. People will go in even 5 times a week and have even a few seconds under a UV light.
Let's put a 500-watt bulb of that in our ceiling and away we go.
Well, I've talked to some patients who have said, oh, yes, I've heard that UV light is good for treating my psoriasis. So I've gone and, gone into a solarium. But the whole problem is if you're going into solarium and you're lying there for a few minutes under a broadband ultraviolet light, then you're much more likely to get cancer from it. And solariums have sort of been banned across Australia and many countries because they do cause cancer. They cause melanomas particularly to evolve in your skin. But yeah, like this is where this translation of what we use in medicine, so narrow band spectrum versus broad band spectrum, is totally lost, and people do their own treatment and can actually cause themselves problems.
Oh, well, time for the boring bit now. What is the best advice as a GP you give people to living a good life and having the right weight and doing things? What is the simple formula that we all should follow?
I think one of the formulas to follow is see your GP. But one of the things that I sort of like came to the conclusion of is that if people don't get the right answer from their GP or their doctor, then they will search elsewhere. And so a lot of people do go searching for a naturopath or a chiropractor or an osteopath to treat different problems. And like even I've had patients who have gone and sought applied kinesiologists. And so a lot of these people like don't have any idea what they're doing. They're not going to be solving your problems. They may be very confident about it. But one of the principles that I'd like to sort of like get out there is if you're not getting the right answer from your doctor, then see another doctor. Like there are many of us, there are thousands of us around Australia. If you're not getting the right answers, then there is somebody else who can help. And you're much more likely to have your problem sorted if you're seeing another doctor and getting another medical opinion than having a naturopathic opinion, for example.
Okay, because I would think this is a little bit like the social media bubble, because everyone's used to getting their answer, particularly with psychiatrists. You go to the psychiatrist and you think you know what's wrong with you when you start, and he goes, oh, no, actually it's this. Then that can happen.
So, I think some people will get an answer that they're not wanting as well. So if you've got cancer and you think that you've treated it by doing your own sort of like green smoothies or coffee enemas, for example, and then you're seeing an oncologist who tells you, no, you've still got cancer, then it's much better if you go and see another oncologist and ask them for their opinion than if you go and see somebody else who's into alternative or complementary medicine, because they may tell you, oh, yes, you've done the right thing and your cancer's gone, without doing any tests or without having any basis for that opinion. So if it's still brewing in you, then you're needing to address it. So I think it's seeking professional and expertise opinions rather than heading into different areas of kookiness.
Of all my relationships, I always get a second opinion, that's for sure. But that's not medicine. But what is medicine and not medicine is fake medicine, Dr. Brad McKay at Hachette. And where could they get that online?
So it should be in all good and bad bookstores, I'm sure, very soon. And it will be available on Booktopia and Amazon too, if you want to order it online.
Cool. And you're going to do the tour, the big rock arena style tour around Australia?
Oh, look, I think COVID is destroying a bit of the travelling tours at the moment. So I think I'll be travelling around my living room. We might have a book launch in the flesh somewhere based in Sydney, to be confirmed. COVID pending, of course, COVID allowing. But yeah, no major sort of like plane trips around the planet at this point of time.
Okay, look, and just a final note there. I know you know a lot of doctors there. You've got a bit of influence. Do you think you could you get me by name into the DSM-6 when it comes out?
Look, I think we are planning for the Maynard disorder to be in the DSM-6.
Yeah,
that is definitely in place.
Put that in your pipe and vape it, kids. Thanks, Dr. Brad. Hello, this is Maynard. Did you know that you could listen to the Skeptic Zone on YouTube? Yes, I know, sounds crazy, but it's true. Also, you can hear 40 logical fallacies with Michelle Bickersma and funny sketches with Richard Saunders and a host of other skeptics. Just click on the YouTube links on the homepage at skepticzone.tv.
Now it's time once again to dive into the treasure trove of Trove, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia, Thousands, dare I say, millions of digitised pages from newspapers, gazettes, journals, periodicals, magazines, and so on. Fully searchable. What a wonderful website it is at trove.nla.gov.au, and for us, certainly here at the Skeptic Zone, a treasure trove indeed. It's educational and quite fascinating to read reports and items going back over the last couple of 100 years here in Australia. And this week I thought we would look for references, reports to the great Harry Houdini. Now, why Harry Houdini? Well, apart from being one of recent history's biggest characters, he certainly made an impression in the skeptical world with his debunking of psychics and so on at seances. In the latter part of his career, he was very desperate to contact his deceased mother, and soon discovered that the seance he attended, well, the psychics were pulling all sorts of shenanigans and trickery, and believe it or not, that still goes on today. Houdini is also credited as the first man to fly an aeroplane in Australia, although that is disputed. He was, at the very least, one of the first men to fly an aeroplane in Australia. And we now turn to Trove, and we have many results come back when we search for Harry Houdini, as you may well imagine. But let's pick one up here from the year 1910. And this is published in the Daily News from Perth, Western Australia, Thursday, the 17th of February, 1910. The Handcuff King performs in the Yarra. Now, the Yarra is the name of the river running through Melbourne. Melbourne, this afternoon. Houdini, the Handcuff King, in the presence of about 4,000 people with his hands handcuffed behind him and with a chain on his legs, dived into the Yarra this afternoon from the Queen's Bridge. In about a minute, he reappeared free from the shackles. Of course, Houdini was famous for many things, not least travelling around the world giving performances. And the next item comes to us from the Advertiser, Adelaide, South Australia, dated the 12th of March, 1910. Houdini takes a milk bath. Houdini at the Melbourne Opera House on Wednesday night, says The Age, again interested a crowded audience by performing another of his mystifying acts. This time he fooled a syndicate of milkmen, which endeavoured to drown him in a huge can of milk. Houdini had nightly escaped from the same can filled with water, and the milkmen came to the conclusion that he had succeeded because he could see through the water. The milk vendors had thought the whole business out. There isn't any water in ours, they reasoned. Therefore, Houdini won't be able to see where the catches are that release him. He'll either have to drink the whole can full or be drowned. Houdini delivered his customary lecture attired in dress clothes and impressed upon his audience the risk he ran, in order that the desire of the yodelers that he should meet his end ingloriously in a can of milk should be frustrated. He stationed a man with an axe and a stop clock in a position where he might rush to the can and chop gaps in it should he not appear in a certain time. Then, to show that he really did go in under the milk, he submerged himself in the best pasteurized Willamere for a minute and a half without the lid on, and emerged happy. Then he went under for the test. The can was filled to the brim. Houdini, as far as could be seen, sank under the fluid. The lid was clapped on and locked, and the canopy drawn over. In less than 3 minutes, Houdini was free, and the can locked and filled with milk was still there. The milk carters stood amazed, and the whole house applauded. Just to show that he liked milk, Houdini took another bath in the same can, which, like the widow's curse of oil, seemed to be always full. Houdini frankly admitted that it was all a trick. But you don't know how it's done. Now, we've seen many times on TV and movies and so forth recreations of Houdini's life and the milk can escape, but wouldn't it have been marvellous to see it in person? Now, the next item we have comes to us from the Sydney Morning Herald, dated the 17th of March 2010. Learning to fly. Experiments in Victoria. Melbourne, Wednesday. In a lonely paddock at Diggers Rest, barely 30 miles from Melbourne, two men are learning to fly. They are Mr. Harry Houdini and Mr. Rolf C. Banks. Side by side in the paddock stand two large tents, which house Mr. Houdini's Vice biplane and the Wright aeroplane, which was recently imported to Australia and has been placed in charge of Mr. Banks. Mr. Houdini is already well known to the public by his escapes from chains and bonds. His ambition is to be master of air and aviation. For a month past, he and Banks have been waiting for a favourable opportunity of competing for the honour of the first Australian flight. The Vice biplane was purchased by Mr. Houdini from Messrs. Sanchez, Beza and Eduardo Bello, aviators who had flown this machine in France for a continuous period of 1 hour and 20 minutes. Mr. Houdini has only made a few short flights. He is, in his own words, only a fledgling. That is to say, he has been instructed in the handling of the machine and he has flown but needs practice. For almost a month past, he has motored daily to the flying field, but only 2 or 3 times has the weather allowed even an attempt at flying to be made. The Wilbur Wright aeroplane, on which Mr. Rolf Banks hopes to be the first in Australian flight, is now slowly emerging from the shapeless and battered condition in which it was left by an accident on March 1. And now we come to a report on Friday the 18th of March 1910 in the Barrier Minor, which is from Broken Hill, New South Wales. Successful biplane flights. Melbourne, Friday. Houdini, the handcuff king, made 3 successful flights in a biplane in a paddock at Diggers Rest today. He circled 3 miles in 4 minutes. And more reports come to us from the Brisbane Courier, dated the 22nd of March 1910. Flying in Australia. Harry Houdini's attempt at aviation have been crowned with success, says a Melbourne message on Friday last. After a month of patient waiting, with only 3 or 4 opportunities for attempt, Houdini made 3 successful flights at Diggers Rest this morning. The performance was witnessed by 9 people. The Vice biplane was taken out of its tent shortly before 8 o'clock. The weather was more propitious than he had experienced since he installed the machine in its quarters at Diggers Rest a month ago. And I just pause here to remind you that sometimes it's hard to read the reproduction here of the newspapers from all those years ago. They can be a bit blurry. So we read on. Then Houdini took the seat and was ready for the first flight. Grrr, went the propeller as it bit madly through the air. A quick touch by the aviator to the engine, clutch, and his side set, the machine rolling, and Houdini was off at a speed which quickly rose to over 30 miles an hour. When he had travelled about 40 or 50 yards, he raised the elevating planes, and the great machine leapt into the air as birds spring into the night. He was only trying his wings and went to no great height. Sweeping around in a comparatively narrow circle, he was back to earth within a minute. Houdini brought the biplane to the ground with scarcely a jar. The second flight was made with a confidence heightened by the first success. The Birdman made a complete detour of the paddock, covering between 1 and 2 miles in his flight. As before, he came down in an easy, graceful fashion. The third flight lasted 3.5 minutes. Houdini swept boldly away from the flying field, confident of his control of the plane, and passing over rocky rises and stone fences, described a great circle which was at the lowest estimated well over 2 miles. the descent was faultless and the plane came within 20 feet of the starting point, where the little knot of witnesses was standing. The greatest altitude set down by the witnesses was over 100 feet. On his return to Melbourne by motorcar, Houdini talked of his flights unaffectedly, but with the elation of the successful entertainment. "Yes, I've done it," he said. "When I went up for the first time, I thought for a minute that I was in a tree. Then I know I was flying." And oddly enough, that story doesn't seem to be continued on the page as far as I can see, but that's okay. I think we got most of the report. And here we have the next report. This one's from the Singleton Argus, dated the 3rd of May, 1910. Houdini in the air. Record flight at Rose Hill. Houdini, the handcuffed king, made a record flight in his aeroplane at Rose Hill Park Racecourse on Sunday. A crowd of several hundreds had gathered, and shortly after 12:30, they were rewarded for their patience with the sight of a weird-looking machine circling gracefully around the track at a height of nearly 150 feet. And as a quick aside, Rose Hill Race Track is in Sydney. Houdini made a successful start, and his plane, driven by a powerful 6080 HP ENV motor, leapt to a height of about 20 feet. It then dipped and rushed towards the ground at a rate bordering on 40 miles an hour. The public gasped, while a number of women screamed, for it seemed as if the aviator were rushing to certain destruction. A neat turn of the lever controlling the planes, however, altered its direction to a nicety, and the machine soared gracefully skyward until an altitude of 150 feet was reached. But his difficulties were not over. The machine rose until at a height of 200 feet it turned and met the wind full in the face. It quivered and fell swiftly towards the ground, as the engines had stopped. It looked as if Houdini's last moment had come. The crowd was dumbfounded, but when only a few feet from the ground, the plucky aviator managed to start his engines again, and the plane rose once more. Houdini then circled around the racetrack twice, finishing up by sailing over the grandstand and dipping easily to the ground on the opposite side. It was a splendid flight. A better demonstration of modern aeronautics could not have been provided, and the public cheered heartily, many rushing to seize Houdini by the hand when he reached the earth. "That's my 14th fly in Australia," Houdini remarked as he landed, "and I am satisfied." He was carried shoulder high by the excited crowd. The machine, which was practically uninjured, excepting a slight bent tube, is now to be dismantled, as Houdini is taking it with him to America. It would be hard to imagine, if you were living in that day and age, a more exciting spectacle, and carried off by such a well-known performer as Harry Houdini. Now let's skip forward 16 years, and a report in The Week from Brisbane, published on the 5th of November 1926. Harry Houdini, New York, October 31. A message from Detroit says that Harry Houdini, the world's famous magician, is dead, aged 52. Harry Houdini, the famous magician, was born at Appleton, Wisconsin on April 6, 1874. And as an aside, I'll say he really was born in Hungary, but like to put it out there that he was really born in America. He was the son of Reverend Dr. Mayer Samuel Weiss, but changed his name to Houdini. He began his career as a trapeze performer in 1882 and made several tours of the world, performing before many rulers and notables. His main accomplishments were breaking out of jail cells, chains, manacles, and sealed boxes, in which he was thrown into the water. When in Australia, in 1910, in addition to escaping from the Yarra, into which he was thrown manacled from Princess Bridge, he tried his hand at flying.
He claimed to have been the first successful flyer in Australia, and the American Who's Who records that he was awarded a prize by the Australian Aeronautical Society for his feat. Houdini, who has written many books on the magician's art, has appeared in a number of moving pictures of the thriller type. He was known as the man who mystified the world. And on Saturday, the 27th of November 1926, from the Evening News, Rockhampton, messages from Houdini. Claims by spiritual mediums. Australian cable service. New York, 25th of November 1926. Dozens of mediums claim to have received a message from Houdini, but the magician's widow says that none contains the key note of words agreed upon before his death. The widow revealed today that her husband made a compact to communicate, if possible, after death with her, Sir Conan A. Doyle, and an unknown friend in Philadelphia. Houdini gave his wife a 10-word message, which she is keeping secret. The Scientific American published a message as a communication from Houdini by a medium at Brattleboro, Massachusetts, but the widow says he did not have the right words. And finally, let's wrap this up with a report from 1947. The Truth magazine, published in Brisbane on the 2nd of November. Not one word from dead Harry Houdini. New York, Saturday. 7 men waited in vain last night for some sign from the departed spirit of the world-famous escapologist Harry Houdini. Halloween night was the 20th anniversary of his death, but Houdini didn't come through. Before he died, Houdini promised that he would attempt to return his spirit to Earth. So, last night, a group of 7 men, members of the Waiting for Houdini committee, waited in a dark room to see if the greatest magician of them all could keep his promise. It was agreed that the supreme test would be accomplished if the spirit of Houdini could inscribe 10 words which had been given to Joseph Dunninger, chairman of the committee, before Houdini died. Last night, the group headed by Dunninger sat in total darkness in Dunninger's office while the medium attempted to contact the spirit of Houdini. The séance began at midnight and was abandoned 15 minutes later. Afterwards, Dunninger reported that the sensitive buzzer set up to receive sensitive vibrations had not buzzed, nor had there been any movement of the delicate scale on a glass dome, a scale that could be moved only by a spirit hand. In fact, nothing happened except the ringing of a phone. The group was startled when the phone caller said, "This is Harry." But it turned out to be a prankster who had heard of the séance. Houdini gave Dunninger 10 words before he died in Detroit on Halloween night in 1927. At the same time, he was demonstrating his perfect physical condition and invited a friend to punch him on the chest. The friend complied with the request, and Houdini died a short time afterwards. For 18 years, his widow had also waited for a message from her departed husband without success. She died 2 years ago. And there we have it, a scant few of the many, many reports about Harry Houdini published in Australia throughout the decades of the 20th century. And the more I do this segment on Trove and read about fantastic reports from the past, the more I wish I could see these. But you can see, and I will link to this in the show notes, you can see a movie made at the time of Harry Houdini flying at Diggers Rest in Australia. But to whet your appetite.
Known to millions of theater goers the world over for his amazing and spectacular feats of magic and physical skill, Harry Houdini, famous star, is pictured here as he adds another chapter to his accomplishments of daring. In those days, when an aviator kissed his wife goodbye, it was no idle gesture. Houdini had to be a wizard to get out of this thing alive. He's resolved on the first successful hop ever made in Australia. It was only a 2.5-minute flight, but it established a record and earned Houdini a permanent place in aviation history.
Harry Houdini, one of the great showmen of the 20th century. And those reports come to us again from Trove at trove.nla.gov.au.
Thank you for listening to The Skeptic Zone, and thank you very much to Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan for taking time out to chat with me, and Mr. Tom Toms the cat, who was very curious to see all the equipment set up in Siobhan's apartment when I did the interview. Lovely, lovely, very nice, Mr. Tom Toms. And further to our conversation about using so-called alternative or complementary medicines at the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse. It's a tricky one because obviously from my point of view and probably from many of your points of view, things like acupuncture and reflexology and so on, well, it's pretty well understood that they don't work and the mechanism behind them doesn't work and can't work. But then again, sometimes you're in a situation of picking your battles and not being too critical of men and women undergoing cancer therapies and life-threatening situations. Anyway, be that as it may, it's just not all black and white, is it? I'm sure you have your own thoughts and opinions on that. Thank you to those people who continue to support the Skeptic Zone at Patreon or PayPal at skepticzone.tv, and those people who've recently come on board. And also, I'm delighted to say I've sold one of the photographs that I have for sale at skepticzone.tv. Scroll to the bottom of the page and you'll see a gallery of photographs. Some are free. I've got 4 free ones, which are up on Wiki actually. You can have and print out and enjoy. And there are many more, almost 50 ones available on the store. If you click the link there, have a look. You might find one you like. Coming up on next week's show, it's a bit of a mystery to me because for the first time in a long time, I haven't got things sort of lined up ahead of time. So it's a bit of a mystery. But I can tell you what I am doing on Friday night here in Sydney, Australia, Australian time, Australian Eastern Time, or is it Eastern Daylight Time, whatever time, 8:30. I am taking part in Maynard's live Facebook quiz. And I'll link to that in this week's show notes. So if you're around on Friday evening, about 8:30, tune in to Facebook and enjoy Maynard's quiz with me in the background, and it's all live and interactive. But as always, you can go to maynard.com.au and check out Maynard's range of wackiness and podcasts and all sorts of things. And before I go, a big thank you to all the people who have contributed to the Skeptic Zone over the years to help me reach number 650. And a big hello to our latest correspondent, Adrian Hill, all the way over there in Canada. I used to live in Canada. Some of you probably know that. In 1968, 1969, my dad, the Reverend R.H. Saunders, was posted to Canada. And we ended up in the little town of Tribune in the province of Saskatchewan. So there's a little known fact. Yes, and I remember the snow being as high as the roof of the house. Fun times. Anyway, big hello to Adrian and a big thank you to all those people out there who have contributed to the show over the years. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production.
The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to the people who listen after the music. This week it's the dice game with a D20. D20. Where's my pencil? There it is. Skeptic Zone pencil. Right. Bring my Skeptic Zone notepad ready. So, for those of you who don't know, this is the part of the show where we roll a die 3 times, something like that. And you use your mystical powers or your dumb luck to guess what numbers come up. And since it's a D20, you can have 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 20. Here it goes in my dice rolling machine. First roll. 18. 18. Okay, next one. Coming up. 14. And the last number is 3. And I'll swap dice to a 6-sided one. This one's got aliens on it. I picked it up at Albuquerque Airport. Here we go. Last roll of the dice with 6 numbers. Guess away. 6. Today's winning numbers 18, 14, 3, and the supplementary is 6.